we're going to get started now with our very first speaker, which is a fantastic speaker, Dina Badreshwara, who is the product lead at Citizens Advice. And she's going to be talking to us about implementing digital.
Hi there, I'm Dina, and I'm going to talk to you about how COVID-19 has affected organisational buy-in. But what do I know? Well, I've worked in the charity and public sector since 2008 at 5 different charities and 1 government department. My current role is as product lead at Citizens Advice, but my roles have ranged from fundraising to marketing and to product. So I have a breadth of experience to bring. I care about the charity sector. I think the work we do is so important. Sometimes that importance is highlighted through external factors and it feels special to a particular time, such as coronavirus. But the work we do will always be important. I'm going to talk you through 7 different aspects of getting buy-in today. But before I get into that, a little bit about Citizens Advice and coronavirus. Lots of the presentations today are going to get into the real detail of the challenge that COVID-19 has brought, from things like working remotely to rapidly creating content that people need urgently. As you can see from this graph, it has had a huge effect on the type of content people are interested in at Citizens Advice. And we've had to work quickly to meet user needs. I'm going to talk briefly about the trends that we're seeing. In the past 3 months, our website has been viewed 15.8 million times. That's a 24% increase on the same period last year. In the first month, concerns were changing on a daily basis. People were searching for things like sick pay, holidays, benefits, and bills. But the most searched word on our website was coronavirus. In the second month, demand for advice became more consistent, and the top 6 most viewed pages remained broadly the same throughout that month. The most searched for word was furlough. And in month 3, things were getting volatile again, and 4 of the top 10 pages are about redundancy. There's also topics around issues on ending your tenancy and divorce springing up. The most searched word on our website is redundancy. I'm sure most of you will have seen this meme floating around, but COVID-19 really has meant that charities have needed to embrace digital now more than ever. And this isn't just about ensuring your clients, your users, your customers, your donors, whatever you want to call them, are able to access your services and donate to you. This is transformation because you've had to invest in IT to ensure your staff can work remotely and that the technology they're using is safe. Coronavirus will not be going away soon, and these investments we're making now need to be long-term. If you're able to step back a little, now is a really good time to start thinking about how you get buy-in for digital projects. And the first thing I think about when considering how to get buy-in is change. I really like change management and I really like psychology. Product thinking, digital transformation, digital change, whatever you want to call it, can be really hard. And it's not possible to land that task on one team and for them to succeed. It's often a whole organisational shift that needs to take place, and the organisation needs to change. So you can begin to work on stuff like that, which is obviously important and satisfying, really hard, or you can try and build good stuff, which is in with your control to build. Whatever you're working on, if it's digital, the chances are you will be blocked in some way, and usually that's based on money. For example, it's much more important to deliver XX service and therefore we cannot fund your fancy online thing. Or most of our audience isn't online and therefore we won't fund your fancy online thing. Fancy online thing is usually just important online thing. This is where you can start thinking about how to make the most of a bad situation. As Citizens Advice, we know we need to urgently find new ways to reach people. whether that's by video or chat or in community settings. And we're making a case to pilot, test and scale new ways of reaching our clients that need us most, many of whom are facing incredibly tough circumstances. Change is hard, but keep going. I think about loss of control a lot, and this is where the psychology comes in, I suppose. But it is so important, and I highlight it because in my experience, it's been such a big blocker in getting good digital work done. People just find it hard to give up control of their functions, of their money, of their ego. And this is where organisation structure and digital transformation needs to come into play. It's not fair to put that responsibility onto a head of digital or equivalent type role, especially if you're also expecting that person to do things like manage your social media channels. I think that some heads of digital who are expected to manage organisational change, this huge thing, and then also write and respond to Facebook posts is just frankly bizarre. So how do you get people to care? Ideally, this is why you need digital trustees and senior representation and diversity at a senior level, things that charities aren't that great at doing. And usually charities are pretty hierarchical too. So it's important to have people championing you and your work at a high level. If you're not in a senior position, it's your job to help your managers get those ideas to the top. If your exec board tend to focus on ROI, for example, try and speak their language, integrate your work with theirs even. Aim to get them excited and give them something tangible to talk to their chief exec friends about. Usually, if the chief exec wants something to happen, they'll make it happen. Refer to scenario planning and business cases, which I'll talk about in a sec. An example of when I've done something like this is to build a case with our individual giving team to find out more about offline and online relationships with donations. This work was really closely aligned to the individual giving team because they wanted to understand donor behaviour, and it met my objective of increasing online donations. And senior people were excited to talk about that work. So how do you build a case? If it's a digital product, you'll usually have data and research you can pepper through a business case. I won't go through each stage here as most are fairly obvious, but if you want buy-in for something, you usually have to make a documented case for it, and it's good practice to do that too. Another good thing to do and to know about is scoping and scenario planning. It can be used as a precursor to writing a business plan, but I mostly use this type of exercise within product management to make a decision on something. It will help you and others understand different options, potential impact and risk. And if you're a product person like me, then you'll probably be familiar with doing an opportunity proposal, which is a shorter version of a business case and looks at things like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Who do you want to solve the problem for? What are the existing solutions for this? Why is our organisation best suited to solve this problem? And how will we know when we've solved the problem? An example I have of this is making a case for attribution modelling when I was at the NSPCC. The problem was that we were spending money on TV advertising, but not really understanding its impact on online donations, other than seeing general peaks in Google Analytics, which we attributed to PPC. So were people Googling our brand name after seeing a TV ad, or was there no correlation between TV and PPC? Based on how much money we were spending, it was important for us to understand donor behaviour here. And there was a case that we were either spending too much on TV and not seeing a return, or attributing to PPC when it should have been TV, which would impact media spend and channel strategy. The fundraising director could clearly see the benefit of this work and gave it the green light. And this moves us on nicely to people who do care about your work and whether that's a good or a bad thing. Usually big projects will report into a board or a senior team. If you report into a board, what is their role? What do they care about? Are they helpful? Do they make you think differently and challenge you appropriately? Do they take ownership and sell your work across the organisation? And do they support you when you're in trouble? It's really important to manage your expectations of them and them of you. Also, if there are managers between you and the board, ensure they understand your work and are supportive, because this level of people can become unsupportive at times, and they're easy to miss because they're not in your day-to-day and they're not on the board. As with process, which I'm going to talk about next, if the governance of your work isn't working for you, think about how to appropriately challenge and ensure it does work for you. And part of being able to do that is to understand the process you need to follow to get stuff done. Process may change due to coronavirus. You may be able to do things faster. You may be able to encourage a test and learn environment. For example, at Citizens Advice, our innovation lab quickly got involved in how to support our advisors who needed to get set up to work remotely, and working with Citizens Advice, local Citizens Advice, on how we use technology to support more people. It's also a good time to get funding for projects, both externally and internally. For example, funding to make improvements that will support people who need it due to coronavirus, but will also have a long-term benefit to your organisation. Some people love process and rules, and often it's the people in your project management office, if you have one, that just love process. Abide by them to get things moving and kicked off, but also talk to them about how you work, which might be agile, and how it would be good to explore different ways of working on digital products. It's not always possible to fix time, cost, and scope with digital products, which is quite different from traditional ways of working. An example of something I'm working on at the moment is how we move forward from things like data protection impact assessments and equality impact assessments, from being living documents to action we take as a team. For example, with the equality impact assessment in particular, we have an opportunity to look at how we're building equality into our decision making. How are we ensuring we're building an inclusive content management system? That's the kind of documentation and process I think creates real value for the organisation and the public who use our services. And now onto the very important stuff, how to get money. Understanding how money works in your organisation is key. This isn't about being greedy or trying to get money to do frivolous and pointless things. We're not in the corporate sector here, but we all know how hard it can be to get money for digital projects. So it's worth doing some work to look at how money works in your organisation. What type of projects typically get funding? What type of projects, how can you support those projects, even with a thread of digital work within them? Can you pitch for money when it's time for business planning? How easily can money be moved around? Something that has successfully worked for me before is understanding which teams typically underspend and getting a piece of that pie. Even better if your work is closely related to their budget, as they can take equal credit for doing a really good piece of work. But remember to try and make it tangible with good metrics. Digital is where the measurement is at, and sometimes that's why it can be extra scary to people who have previously relied on their offline magic metrics. But it means that you can measure the life out of what you do, for better or for worse. An example of when I've made a case using measurement is to use the language and model used by individual giving teams. For example, applying lifetime value and attrition. fundraising team and the exec team understand that language. They've seen that sort of thing before. They're used to seeing numbers in that way. So even doing something simple like dividing your key metric by digital investment made gives you a number. And sometimes all you need to show is a number. When I was at Public Health England, I worked on the Couch to 5K app. Our problem was that we couldn't get money from the budget to invest in the app because it wasn't a strategic priority for the organisation. I was able to make a pitch for improvements to the app based on some scenario planning, especially around reputational impact. Whilst the app isn't strategically a priority, a lot of people talk about it, and I was able to be clear about what might happen if we didn't invest. And I did this at a time when I knew that some teams would have underspent on their budget. So I knew that there was money available and I got it. I think there's quite a lot there on tips and techniques to get buy-in, but if all else fails, get someone else to do it. I've had experiences where none of what I've described works. No matter what I try, it just doesn't work. I was in a situation where nothing was working for me, but I was really committed and passionate and believed that I was doing the right thing. And in this situation, it's important to look for the people who the decision maker trusts and respects and ask them to make that ask for you. I know it kind of sucks as you have to do all the hard work and someone else will get the credit, but you will know who the real winner was in that situation. Sometimes it's worth just getting someone else to do it. Finally, a bit about leadership during change. Being a good leader is obviously important, but during a crisis like this one, it's even more important. And if you've done any kind of change management, you'll be aware of these points. It's important to be intentional about what you're challenging and what you're supporting, and to be sure to model your own actions consistently with expected behaviour. So firstly, accept the limitations of what is possible. Change in behaviour is not often linear or predictable. Notice where energy is focused. What are people currently focused on, and what's the outcome of that? Talk throughout the leadership community about outcomes and get the leadership team speaking with one voice. Maintain a high profile. Keep discussing your work at every opportunity, keeping your vision on the agenda. This isn't necessarily about your personal profile. This is about the profile of the work. Observe the effects of interventions made, especially the direction of the work and any knock-on effects it's having. Hold firm to the non-negotiable outcomes, but negotiate on other issues where you can. You need to be flexible. Celebrate and mark milestones on the journey. Your team will hugely appreciate that. And be open to new information that might lead you to redefine your direction. And the final message I want to leave you with is to stay positive. The work we do can be really hard, and it can be hard to get people to care about it. But there is so much good work that happens in our sector, and people care about changing it for the better, which is brilliant. Don't lose your passion and keep going. Thank you.
Hey, that was really brilliant. And I'm sure it resonated a lot with a lot of our audiences. We've had a few questions and I'd love to go through those with you, but I also would like to say in the chat audience, it would be great to hear some of your stories about where you have encountered organizational barriers when trying to implement a digital product and what you might have done in terms of what you might have done in terms of overcoming some of these, because I'm sure there's a lot of great stories out there. I love your gifts. Can I just say, a good presentation should always have gifts. That's a very important part. And I also love you referring to this fancy online thing. I feel like I've heard a lot of people talking about the fancy online thing. Yeah. So we've had a few questions. So the one that I think is interesting, well, the one that I'm going to start to talk about is COVID-19 has actually turned this a little bit on its head, hasn't it? Because suddenly everybody wants to do digital stuff, even people who were maybe not that interested about it before. Now everybody wants a piece of the digital pie. Everybody's a digital expert. Everybody wants to be in all of the product teams. So you're almost having the opposite problem of, you know, having to say, listen, I've been doing this for a while now. Please let me do my job. I mean, is that something you've encountered? What is it? I mean, obviously it could be a good thing, but how has that affected your work as a product lead?
It's affected my work in lots of different ways, actually. So in terms of my own day-to-day, I'm a product lead working on building a new content platform. And that's very much still in the midst of early days. So my team is concentrating on just ploughing through what you have to do to migrate a pretty big website. But in terms of the content that sits on that website, that's where the work is going in at the moment. So there's a content team at Citizens Advice, which are furiously working on COVID-19. And they have had to essentially restructure the team in some ways to manage that program of work that's coming through. So it's been an interesting challenge specifically for that team. It's affected me because some of the people from that team have had to move on to different projects. So we're just working around things like that at the moment. But it's also been really positive in a lot of ways because, like you said, people are thinking much more about reaching people through digital channels. And that hasn't always been the case. And so it's meant that some of our service delivery teams and ops teams are working much more closely with us now. And we're building good relationships there. So it's been pretty positive, I think.
Well, it seems we may have lost Claire there, but hopefully she'll be able to join us back in a minute. She may have just had a Wi-Fi issue. This is what we love about virtual events. But that sounds brilliant. I feel like you're so right. The COVID-19 has really chucked everyone in the deep end a little bit. So we've really had to bounce back from that. So it's brilliant that you're able to support people. Another question that we've got from an anonymous attendee is, what do you do to build good relationships with people more senior than you who are decision makers?
I usually start with listening and learning about their work, especially if I'm going into an organisation new. It's really important to understand what people's priorities are and what their objectives are. Often it's really important to try and work together and create win-win situations between teams. So listening and understanding is really important at that kind of level. And then working together on how you can build something that works to meet both of your objectives is quite helpful. But also trying to understand more about them personally and engaging with that. It can be really hard if someone's much more senior than you to do that. But I think if you start on the basis of understanding what they're interested in at work, that's really helpful.
That's brilliant. I think that's such an important thing to be able to make those relationships work and keep that bridge building as you go, especially in times like this. We've got another question here from Samantha Evans. Any advice for small charities that do not have a comms team? Currently, most comms managers are managed by fundraisers. How do we persuade that team that digital should be part of everyone's role?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Samantha. I've had varying experience of this, to be honest. I've had experience of organisations trying to embed digital in every role by putting it in people's job descriptions, and mostly in fundraisers' job descriptions, which has been interesting. That kind of process has to be managed really, really well, because obviously changing job descriptions is quite a big deal, but I have seen that happen. So I'm just going to read that question again. Currently, most comms managed by fundraisers. How do we persuade them that digital should be part of everyone? Yeah, so how do you persuade them of that? Something that's worked quite well for me before is using some change management methodology. So trying to use the people that you have really good relationships with in the fundraising team as your change agents, essentially. So you're imparting all of your knowledge onto them, and then it's their responsibility to start spiderwebbing that out to everybody they know. And then it's their job to just talk about digital as much as they can, and they're basically like a mini you that's embedded in a fundraising team. That's worked really, really well for me before, because it means that you've always got someone championing your work in another team.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think it is hard when you are in a smaller team. You need to be able to find that balance. No, I think you've explained that really well. Hopefully that helps, Samantha. And we do have Claire back with us, which is brilliant news. Hi, Claire, how are you?
Back.
I'll leave you both to it to carry on. We've just been going through the questions, so Claire, I'll let you pick up. Claire, are you okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sorry about that. This is fun. But I'm assuming you guys have continued and done a great job.
We have. We've gone through the questions, but I'll let you carry on with those.
Fantastic. Well, I did have a couple of more. I don't know if you've covered impact yet, but I did want to talk about a little bit about that and how important it is to use the metrics that digital gives us. And you said sometimes it's bad news, as people have been used to. I remember in a previous conversation, somebody said people used to just show crying pictures of children and that was enough, and now they want real numbers, and that can be a bit of a shock to the system. But it can also be very overwhelming for, especially for people who haven't sort of grown up in this world, to have suddenly so many numbers at their disposal. Is that something you've encountered? Can you talk about how to manage the influx of metrics and make them relevant to decision makers?
Yeah, it's so true. When you're looking at something like Google Analytics, especially, there's so much information there, and it's tempting to just pull off every little piece of information that's possible and relevant, or you think is relevant. And it can end up just being really overwhelming to people, and especially overwhelming to senior people. Something that I found worked quite well for me when I was at Marie Curie and had data analysis as part of my role was distilling as much as possible. So starting off with that massive amount of data and then trying to distill and funnel it as much as possible in order to get to the end of the funnel, which is that really important number. Because what has often happened is sometimes you just won't know what senior management are interested in until you get into that board meeting or into the senior management meeting or whatever. So you need to have all of that data in your head or somewhere that you can refer to if you get asked the question. So yeah, going in with these are my top 3 things, which is what I usually do. I'll go top 3, or try and visualize as much as I can, but then having the backup of this is how I got here is important, I think.
I think that's great. And I think it's all part of this translation role, isn't it? That you and people in your roles have to do between what's happening and then senior decision makers who need that familiarization.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really good to try and tell a story as much as you can with that data. And so writing it out into words or showing it in a chart or a graph is much more helpful than just pure numbers on a spreadsheet.
Great. And you've worked at a number of last question, I guess, and then we'll move on to the next sessions. You've worked at a number of organizations. I'm sorry if this has already been asked. I'm dealing with, while I was dealing with overheating computer. What do you think has changed in terms of, not, you know, beyond the current crisis? Are you seeing senior decision makers, senior fundraisers, people who do the service delivery, are you seeing them really embrace digital in a different way over the last few years? Are you actually feeling that there is a shift in the mentality? You talked about boards, and are you seeing boards being more involved in them as well?
Yeah, so personally for me, what I've been seeing is much more engagement and boards being set up. So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and what I was trying to get at in the presentation was having a board isn't always a good thing.
Yes.
And not because I don't want someone to be accountable for the work or take interest in it, but more because governance often just needs to be different depending on what you're working on, and it needs to work for the product or the campaign or whatever it is that you're working on. The board is meant to be there to be a helpful set of people that can push forward and be accountable for something, not to ask you really challenging questions for the sake of asking you challenging questions. So whilst I think there's been a good level of engagement, I think there's still quite a lot of work to do when it comes to how to be accountable for digital projects and how to be accountable at a really senior level for digital work, because this is often work that is iterative and continuously needs to be improved upon, and therefore needs continuous budget, and charities aren't really used to working in that way. We're not tech companies, so finding that model, I think, has been quite hard.
Great. And do you think the current crisis is changing that, at least to some extent? It certainly freed up some digital budgets, suddenly.
True. Yeah, I think it is having a good impact in that sense, and I think it will continue to, because it will stay like this for a while. So yeah, I think it will. Final
word of advice for our attendees, and attendees, if you have any advice for your fellow attendees as well, in terms of how to get that buy-in, but also how to make your senior stakeholders understand how this is different from what they might be doing, you know, in the rest of their businesses.
I would say my final bit of advice would be to listen as much as possible and be aware of the conversations that are happening across the organisation and how you can be involved in those. Being in a digital team or working in that area doesn't give you the right to have that kind of arrogance of, well, we've already been doing this, so, you know, get on board with us. That's just not really what we're about. It should be about listening and learning and trying to work together to push forward the whole organisation, not just one aspect of it. And so I would say listening and learning from everyone is important.
I think that's absolutely fantastic advice, and just taking everybody on that journey with you is really what we should all be striving for. And I think, you know, hopefully now there's a lot of goodwill around that. Thank you, Dina. I thought that was wonderful, even the bit I missed. Sorry about that.